the material, the morontial, and the spiritual, I'm proposing a continuum, a connection. I'm going to suggest the possible connections or coherences and the ways we can manage the material to harmonize with the morontia to become aware of the spiritual. They, in my opinion, are just a continuum, a physiological continuum, an electromagnetic continuum, and a psychological continuum. So this is a pretty picture with the seven adjutant mind spirits as the trunk of a tree, which I call the personality tree. And then we're on this side of the tree in the physical world, trying to cohere using our wisdom with our spiritual selves, all the way up to eventual fusion, using matter with the spirit of truth to cohere with the spirit. Cohere just means to be influenced to the point of resonance or commonality. So, what is spirit energy? And for that matter, what can we do about it? And can we pattern our material energy? We do exist in a material reality, and that's the tool we've been given. We've been given these tools in the physical body and in the brain, and we have to use those tools to be receptive to spiritual alignment, to realize our spiritual identity and transfer the seed of our identity to the spiritual. So in this spotlight, I'm going to talk about 34 different areas that either are directly involved in what I feel to be this coherence mechanism or this harmonization mechanism, or that they are related to the things that are material coherence mechanism. There are all kinds of quotes from the Urantia book that support this concept. Quotes like, the greater the spirit energy divergence, the greater the observable function of mind. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment, calm the exterior interventions, and calm the mind, because this is going to take some serious concentration. Essentially, I've done the research over the past couple of years on the material energies, and I'm looking for these coherence mechanisms for our electrochemical physical functions of body and brain that might shed some light, pun intended, on our spiritual to material interassociations. And I'm also looking at the mindal emotional mechanisms and the physiologies that are involved in those, and our ability to detect, enhance, improve the receptivity of spiritual influence in each of those areas. And I want you all to realize that this is just Geoff Taylor's speculation. There's no hard science correlating. There's lots of supposition, and I have about 120 different research articles in the final document that speak to each of these areas and the coherences in each of those areas. But this is a field that's very new, the combining of science and religion, or science and spirituality. This is a particularly good quote. The non-spiritual mind is either a spirit energy manifestation or a physical energy phenomenon. Even human mind, personal mind, has no survival qualities apart from spirit identification. So really what we're looking for is spirit identification mechanisms. And I propose a hypothesis. And this hypothesis, follows through each of the areas that we will be talking about today. I propose that electromagnetic energies range from stationary, i.e. no motion, and all pattern in paradise, to the low frequency motions of matter, up through the higher frequency energies of spirit. So that's the continuum I'm suggesting. I also propose that to the extent that we can align our electromagnetic energies, our material energies, to be sympathetically receptive to spiritual influences, our material energies, both material and optical energies, become more stable because they're being reinforced by spirit and more enduring. Obviously, the culmination of that process is fusion, and we'll talk that as one of the attributes. This is a precursor to a course that the Urantia University Institute is presenting. It'll be a 6-week course, so this is not something that can be done in a 30-minute spotlight presentation. These are very complex, very deep subjects and multi-layered details in the approach. So I'm just going to highlight them, and if you want to come back to any one of them, we can go back and talk a little bit more about that. Here's our first candidate. We are not our thoughts. It's, talking about consciousness. We are not our thoughts. We are the self-consciousness of our thoughts, and we are not to the consequences of this biological activity. We have some free will control over those biological activities. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is the biological over control of those activities. If you think about an electron can sense, is conscious of its field, and is pushed around by the field that it's in. If you think of that as the kind of consciousness, photons also have a sense of the field that they're moving into. We, as individuals, also have a sense of the field we're moving into. We are an electrochemically based entity. So at the very fundamental level, our own electrons and photons are dancing around our body, feeling their respective fields. So we're going to look for ways that we can influence those apparently automatic interactions of electrons and photons. And we'll look at 12 different states of consciousness that range from unconscious to superconsciousness. Once you establish consciousness, once you figure out that you are conscious, you then become aware of other consciousnesses. So we talk about how your consciousness relates to other consciousness. And as it says in the Urantia book, this distinction is vital because you and I only relate via the Supreme. So we talk about our God consciousness and the physiological consciousness of things that influence us. Next thing we're going to talk about is brain, mind, and consciousness. So now connecting brain with mind, with consciousness. The brain, the gray matter, acts as an objective sensor, actuator, and controller, and gives us our subjective perceptions. Consciousness is the base from which we operate, and we operate in a hierarchical of scales. There's 11 dimensions of cascades in the brain functioning mechanism that are in a constant state of building, modification, and teardown that result in our consciousness. And we look at different ways that the different levels of neurons and clusters of neurons are involved in this cascade. And we look at 9 different brain states, which range, as I said, from consciousness, unconsciousness to superconsciousness. I think I confused the consciousness before with 15 states with 15 theories of consciousness, which we delve into. And there are 8 theories. Oh, I'm really confused now. Not sure what that 15 is. I'll have to go back and figure that out. There are actually 8 theories of consciousness, or the top 8 theories of consciousness, and one of them is very intriguing. It's called the quantum consciousness theory. And this is a theory based on the ability of one feature of our anatomy, these microtubules, to function at the quantum level. It's very tricky to function at the quantum level. Quantum is the smallest package of transferable energy. And most of our body is completely unaware of activity at that level, but the microtubules are a very interesting phenomenon. We'll talk about them a little bit later in the program today. There is a very intriguing video when you get a chance. This is a sort of a precursor to the theory of this quantum consciousness, or what they call orchestrated objective reduction, which allows the correlation between things quantum and things material. And that's one of the fundamentals that we're trying to prove in this exploration, is the ability for the quantum energy or the spiritual influence, which probably happens at the quantum level, to influence our material being. Another area we're going to look at is the physiologies of body consciousness. So the body itself, every cell in your body is conscious of or aware of the neighboring cells. And we'll look at the different proteins and peptide building blocks in our body that make up our DNA and the 34,000 emotions that we play with. And we'll explore how they fold and change, and different ways that we can influence that folding and changing mechanism to improve our spiritual receptivity, or to be aware of that receptivity. Intercellular communication. The picture I had up behind me showed these nerve cells. And intercellular communication involves nerve cells, the vagus nerve being the longest one, but they vary in length, and we have a lot of them in our body. And we will take an in-depth look at the functioning of the synaptic end, the axon end, and these little insulators which insulate the axon. When we're young, we don't have these insulating coatings when we're trying to figure out how to ride a bicycle, or to move our hands, or to become who we are. These form and solidify our ways of thinking in our maturing ages. And we talk about that whole process and what is the difference between thought adjuster to changer. What makes it change from a thought changer to a thought adjuster? What happens when it changes to thought controller? We look at some of the physiologies of those changes. One of the ways that we can change the fundamental genetic makeup of our bodies is to change the way the DNA folds. And the way you change the folding of the DNA, which means it's either going to become a brain cell or a gallbladder, is one of the mechanisms is that called epigenetic modification. So we talk about how you do those epigenetic modifications to influence the way your cells are replicating. We also talk about what makes a cell. All our cells in our body have our same DNA, but a brain cell turns into a brain cell and a gallbladder turns into a gallbladder. How does it know how to do that? That's actually a function of the electromagnetic field with which the cell is dividing and becoming. And so right from the embryonic stage up through adulthood, these cells are influenced by their surrounding electric field. And this Professor Levin did some really interesting work where he created the electric field where an eye would be created in the mid thorax area of the flatworm, and sure enough, an eye developed in the middle of the flatworm. So that's the kind of research we look at to look at the epigenetic or the other changes in DNA replication. It also involves microtubules, which is a really interesting thing. Microtubules, we'll talk about them later. Anyway, the incremental ways that we can change our physiology involves epigenetic modification. The other way one of the ways we can change the way we evolve is with neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, remember those synapses at the ends of those nerves? Well, pre-positioned at each of those synapses are these things called neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters determine how you react to any given situation. And you can determine how those neurotransmitters, or what type of neurotransmitters are placed at those synapses by your previous reactions. So, if you force calmness over and over again, pretty soon you got the calming neurotransmitters at those synapses, and you react to things more calmly. Just look at three or four of those neurotransmitters as just an example. Serotonin, which actually comes from the gut. So think pneumothoracic or heart-lung connection, or brain-heart connections. And it relates to our anxiety levels, our current happiness, our sense of well-being, our appetite, our sleep. Dopamine, we've all heard about dopamine. Well, dopamine is an unexpected benefit. It is involved in our motivation, our pleasure, and our anticipation of future happiness. Glutamate and gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA, is the balance between excitement and the urge to be calm. So these change dramatically from our teenage years to our adult years, and we look at those changes and correlate them to changer, adjuster, controller phase. Just as an example of how neurotransmitters change the way you function, if you drink alcohol or have a sugary ice cream or something like that, the dopamine levels go up, and it's a pleasure trigger of having those. And this happens in the nucleus accumbens, or the pleasure reward center of the brain. And this sets a certain expectation level. Now, to get any dopamine response, you have to go up to get that same pleasure. And this is what leads to the pleasure trap. Can't get enough sugar, or can't get enough alcohol. These sort of addiction mechanisms. So we look at that mechanism. Keep in mind, these can all be overridden by the frontal cortex. You can simply override those cues or keys or indications. One of the things we look at is homeostasis, or what makes us stable, or what gives us equanimity. This is primarily in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a part of the brain that deals with whether we're in constant fight or flight. Are we constantly at an agitation? Are we constantly worried about the war in Ukraine and the Iran, Iraq, or the Israeli-Iran crisis? Are we constantly in that mode, or can we bring it down to a calm state? Brain waves. We will spend some time on where does the superconsciousness reside? And really, there was some really good research that was done some time ago that said there are precursors to your thought. Things are going on in your brain before you're even aware that the thought has arrived, that you've had this thought. That's that 300 millisecond, or almost a half a second before the realization of the thought. We'll follow that mechanism. There's even some pretty good videos these days of that mechanism. You can see, in the case of microtubule electron buildup, you can see it build up and then flash as the thought progresses in the brain. So that's one of the research areas we'll look at. And we'll also look at the electroencephalogram that results in each of those buildup or flash mechanisms. And we'll look at the difference between thought changer, adjuster, and controller in each of those EEG patterns. So this is a picture of a bunch of nerves in the brain, and they're color-coded by different functions. And we look at how people picture things in the brain and what types of brain thinking goes on, right brain, left brain, the parallel processing versus serial processing, or people call it male thinking or female thinking, the different ways that things are grouped and processed in the gray matter of our brain. One of the things we have working in our brain to solidify, once we figure out how we what we want to remember, there are these things called activity-regulated cytoskeletons and synaptic adhesion molecules that actually cement things or make sure that we remember those things. So we can talk a little bit about that process of cementing our memories. The maturing brain. How does the brain change as we move through childhood? What changes with our first moral decision? What's going on in our adolescent years when peer pressure is a dominating factor? And what changes when we know who we are and how to behave? Talk about that neuroplasticity when we get older and we only have a few new neurons, about 700 neurons a day at our age to play with. What do we, how do we make them grow from one area of the brain to another? I think I've mentioned this before, looking for those changes, the changer, adjuster, controller changes in the brain, what makes it function differently. And conversely, what's the common denominator? What is the same when we're a changer and adjuster controller phases of our lives, and how are those enhanced? The Urantia book is always talking about our moral compass. Well, where do those reside in our overall picture? Microtubules. This is the fundamental thing we talked about in the last spotlight. This is a really intriguing feature of our anatomy. It's in every one of the cells in our body. It's part of the structural integrity of the body. I'll just get to the picture here. These green tubes that flow or go through the cell, and they actually extend to connect, have these 13 rows or pillars of what's called dimers. And each one of those little dimers is a bioluminescent molecule, and there's A's and B's, and the light is triggered electrically but cascades down this tube both radially and longitudinally, and acts as a qubit. So it can actually do quantum computing down that cascade of bioluminescence. And it actually is the time between, or involves the time between the sensory input of the cell and the communication of that sensory input to neighboring cells. So this is probably where our consciousness of our consciousness originates. It's where we have the time to think. And my supposition is that it's also involved in the spirit of truth. You got to think, and I'm really jumping the gun here a little bit, but something had to happen at Pentecost physically. You think of the Prince update, biological update, or an intellectual update, and Adam and Eve as the biological update. And Michael might have brought a physical update in that he learned how to arrange his microtubules. You and I can arrange our microtubules. They're growing and shrinking in length and complexity constantly on a moment-by-moment basis, based on how you are currently reacting and thinking and behaving, and whether you're calm and trusting in God, or whether you're frenetic and worried about the next war. They're growing and interpreting for you. And they do have this marvelous ability to speak optically. In other words, they are receptive to optical coherence and mechanical or material resonance, where we live and have our being. Basically, they are the mechanism which can take our material energy and translate it into optical energy. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the future. And I'll just scroll down the next one. When we look at these microtubules, we're looking for a quantum coherence capability. So if you think about the material you as dust to dust, possibly, and these microtubules can turn your dust into optical properties. At any moment in time, a guardian angel could take a picture of your bioluminescence, essentially, which is indicative of how you behave, how you think, how you um, sort things out. Thought adjuster, of course, has your memories, but the microtubules are representative of how you process those. And keep in mind that microtubules, when they're in your brain, are called neurotubules, and they are primarily what drives the electrical activity that triggers your thoughts. So at any moment in time, if the guardian angel took a picture of your bioluminescence or the bioluminescence of your microtubules, they get an idea of how the DNA is folded and how it's behaving, and that could be transferred to Mansonia number one to sort of build a new you, just exactly where you left off down here, to start processing things. There's an intermediate step that's involved, and we call that. I call that hard light, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I'm suggesting that Michael figured out how to organize those microtubules when he was down here, and that he got permission from his dad to say, yeah, you can do that. And on Pentecost, we got, and subsequent to Pentecost, we got the ability to call in the spirit of truth, or to temporarily organize our microtubules so that we can be aware of that spiritual coherence and think like Jesus. And then if we can force that often enough, we become more and more Jesus-like in the way we respond. Remember that fundamental hypothesis at the front end? That was this electromagnetic continuum. So we're seeing in the small optical octave in the middle, but the low frequency end is where the microtubules shake, and then there's a bake in the middle. And the spiritual energies are probably up in the higher frequency ranges. Of course, paradise is way down at this end, not moving at all. And likely the thought adjuster is way up in the 10 to the 25 hertz resonant frequencies up there. So he needs to find a way to speak to us. Best we can hope for is to operate in the optical, perhaps in the ultraviolet. It could be that the midwayers operate in the ultraviolet range, just outside of our visual range. Anyway, so the thought adjusters need to find a mechanism to downstep their high frequency stuff to our material frequencies, and the microtubules afford them that mechanism, because at least they can talk in the optical to us in that. They say, that light, heat, electricity, magnetism, chemism, they're all the same thing in origin, nature, and destiny. So we're talking about that continuum. One of the things that, if we're going to talk about this as a continuum, we have to make the transition from material to light to spirit. And the universities, several universities, have successfully made light behave like a molecule. So I can see how the power directors can artificially introduce this sort of commingled photonic energy with material patterning to kind of recreate our material pattern in what we call hard light, where photons actually behave like matter for this morontial existence. So there is, just like there's an electromagnetic continuum, there's a physiological continuum. And I'm suggesting that there are similar patterns, just like a fractal pattern from the tiniest particles up through DNA to the more cosmic associations of things. We also look at other kinds of mechanisms for coherence: magnetic resonance imaging, magnetic resonance spectroscopy. How could spiritual influence be involved in those? If you're going to cohere, if you're going to match things, you got to have a time stamp. You got to lock in some time frequency, because if you're dancing to it out of sync time-wise, things aren't going to lock. So we talk about our relationship to time and how we perceive that time. And perceiving that time involves the entorhinal cortex, which is the first step in the brain stem, and how it functions as a hub for memory, navigation, and the perception of time. Interestingly enough, the personality is what gives us our unique sense of time. We also have some biological time clocks. So there's multiple different ways of sensing time, right down from the attosecond of the nuclei of our cells, up through the circadian rhythm, up to aging when your hair turns white. So we're aware of time on multiple levels of reality, chronaldic time, or mind time, spirit time, material time. We also talk about feedback loop. If you have a thought, you react to that thought, and that changes the base of that thinking. So we go to that loop and find where we can play in that loop. Look at near-death experience to see, well, what goes on with a near-death experience that makes some people come away from a near-death experience much more spiritual, much more confident in an afterlife. Look at some of the mechanisms, the physiological mechanisms in an NDE. Emotions, we look at the emotions, how they're balanced, how to balance them, how to manage your emotions so that you have the better reactions to those times. And then we talk about some emotional self-mastery, of how to master those changes, those physiological changes like raising your pulse and turning the hair up on the back of your neck kind of thing. We talk about the differences between the linear and parallel processing of thoughts, sentience and God consciousness. And we tend to look at things from the ground up. We're looking at from the material perspective, but we flip the coin at the end of the course to say, well, let's look at this from the top down. How does God look at our progression or our potential coherence mechanisms? Talk about soul physiology, the fundamental things that we need to put in the soul. Is there a physiological base for our soul? What is is the bioluminescence part of our soul? Keeping in mind that photons are eternal, whereas matter is not. There's basically two types of material. It's fermionic energy or photonic energy, and photons are eternal. They keep going, whereas the matter rearranges itself. So really, to the extent that we can get light patterns that are representative of us, we become more eternal. Talk about soul fusion. What does that mean? Well, physiologically, is there a similarity to nuclear fusion where two atoms get so close that there's a release of the extra energy not required to keep them apart? Similarly, if our thinking gets close to our thought adjuster thinking, is there a release of energy? So we talk about some of the physiologies involved in that soul fusion. We also, at the end of the course, go to the philosophy of the physiology of spiritual influences, trying to differentiate how we think about things. We look into this process called transcendental naturalism, which defines how we think and what changes the way we think in that process. I'd like to slow down a little bit now and say that's all physiology. That goes on in your body, whether you know about it or not. What can you do at the higher level or the non-physiological level to influence those things? And here's some take-home points having gone through this. Your physical to physiological link is bidirectional. So what you think involves how you behave, or how you behave involves how you think. So your body supports your mind, so take care of your body. It helps you think. Your attitudes, your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, your reactions, all influence the chemistry and thus influence your spirit receptivity. Talk about those neurotransmitters. Well, you can place the neurotransmitters by consistent decisions, and eventually those neurotransmitters will be prepositioned appropriately for your more spiritual responses. Patientness, openness to reflective thoughtfulness may help. This childlike faith we had as a thought changer phase, your trust in God, just like we had a trust in our parents, but with adult-like focus may help. if we can creatively leap from a stable, calm confidence in God's plan, seems like a good thing. Makes our microtubules grow, gives us that confidence that it's a friendly universe. Where your thoughts go, your energy flows. Your emotions make epigenetic modifications at the gene expression level on an instant by instant basis. We only have the now, but in that now, we can make those changes. If you could align your anticipations with that top-down perspective, with that eternal perspective, that may help. Keep in mind your emotions are your anticipation versus what actually happens. If you anticipate bad and it happens, well, you pretty much expected that. If you expected something and something better happens, you're happy. So controlling your expectations is a process. Allow paradise to be the stable material reference for your sense of these influences, or what we call electromagnetic influences, because but the nuclei of all your atoms are sensing that paradise electric field. Let your thought adjuster be your stable time reference, because he's outside of time. So let him be your time reference for your material motion and purpose. And let the spirit of truth invert your thinking, your consequential thinking, what happens as a consequence of my thinking, to be the habits more like Jesus, the love your enemy kind of inverse thinking. And try to be more aware of spirit time than material time. Am I becoming more godlike? Am I becoming more Jesus-like? How am I doing on that clock? Functionally, specifically, get a good deep night's sleep, because deep sleep is where the thought adjuster is most active. It's where you get repair mechanisms in the brain. Talk substantially about that. One of the states that duplicates deep sleep, if you don't get a good deep sleep, is worship. So good meditative, calm worship is very much the same as deep sleep. Calms the frequencies in the brain. You can show this in electroencephalograms. And in sort of final comment, just be still and know that Mother and her processes are guiding us to find Father, and that process is unfolding as it should. Said differently, your thoughts guide your physiology guides your reactions guide your character guides your values guide your intent, and your intent guides your thoughts. So there's the thought feedback loop. So let your thoughts be adjuster guided, and that loop will become more spiritual.
Thank you. Very interesting. Lots of intriguing points you hit on. Yeah, and clearly more content that you can dive into just in this session, but I'm sure people have some questions. If you do have a question, please try and raise your electronic hand, and we'll call on you in order. Joanne.
Now, Geoff, how many years long is this course going to be?
6 weeks.
How can you do this in 6 weeks? Can you just tell us a little bit how you're going to conduct it?
Yeah, I break it down into chunks. Basically, I think the document is 75 pages, and I just divide that by 6 and look at these these chunks. Everybody gets the whole document at the beginning, and I go through with a video of me reading and explaining each of the sections beforehand. And really, it's not a right-wrong course. It's just an exploration. It's just where we're going to delve into thinking about these processes. And
are we ready?
Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
So yeah, as you were describing this process, it was very interesting, because I was recalling impressions I've had in my life, imprints that are really clear in my mind. And I'll share one of them was as a child, a young child, I remember so clearly sitting on my grandmother's bed and her teaching me the Lord's Prayer. The vision, that impression of the whole scene is like an imprint in my brain. And obviously it had some very significant spiritual meaning to me. And so as you were describing some of the brain synapses and what's going on, that really made sense to me. And again, as we talked about the fusion aspect, there's another material connection to the spiritual reacting with the material. And there's a quote that I always think of, and it talks about harmony is the speech of Havona. And they mention a musician that could come to Urantia and transform the world. And of course, what you're talking about here is how the music could interact and affect the vibrations in your mind.
I speak to two specifics. I talked about activity-regulated cytoskeleton peptides and synaptic adhesion molecules, what we call ARCs and SAMs. They are the things that cement those memories, and that's actually an mRNA-like process. So there's these little capsids that are shuffling around, transferring the information in a virus-like process in the brain to solidify. So you have some fevers that are more than others, where the virus is really taken hold. That your experience could be one of those where these ARCs and SAMs were particularly active in this MRA-like process to cement that memory and make it more long-term visible. That's the kind of thing where there may be some spiritual assistance in these coherence mechanisms. And really what I'm interested in is the actual physiology. We can't speak to how the spirit is doing it, but we can see how the process works and maybe envision that. You also mentioned music. There's a couple of frequencies, G and D in the harmonics, that actually relate to the speed of transfer or the hertz of certain nerve lengths. So certain nerves are excited by certain frequencies, and that may be related to some of those things that make some tunes more pleasant or spiritually enlightening. Thank you.
You mentioned practices that people could do, and listening to certain music is certainly could be one of those practices to help your brain.
Indeed. Especially if you do it in a calm, meditative, God-centric attitude, right? Very good. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Sherry.
I just wanted to add from my personal experience for 25, 30 years now, I've been a dedicated yogic practitioner and not just physical yoga. And I have experienced some of these changes along the way. Changes in my thinking, my physiology changing because of my choice to go deep and to calm my mind on a regular basis. And anyway, I've experienced a lot of the things that Geoff is now putting science to and showing us physiologically how it's happening. So what's exciting to me is to bring the experiences I've had that I was like, well, those are great, aren't they? But I think what Geoff is offering, at least to me, is a way to work ever more consciously in co-creating this spiritual progression, and to consciously know that we have a whole lot more choice in interacting with these spirit powers that we have to consciously create our own personal reality and thus bring more of God life to the rest of our planet. Thank you so much, Geoff. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Remember I mentioned the body, care of the body. That's very much true. The homeostasis, when your body and the mind housed in a body of clean habits, that's real. So anything that can do yoga, intermittent, intensive physical activity, any of those things to maintain that homeostasis that ideal body does wonders for our spiritual receptivity. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. George.
I must confess that I am far from your knowledge, but there has been 2 points that has attracted my attention. And the first one is this type of creating a channel of thinking and by interconnection of synapse. I have experienced that, meaning that, and I quote on paper 100, religious habits of thinking and acting are contributory to the economy of spiritual growth. One can develop religious predispositions toward favorable reaction to spiritual stimuli, a sort of conditioned spiritual reflex. So that illustrates a little bit what you just said about this building of a channel of thinking. And there is also another quote that you gave, which in my opinion is very important in the experience of coming from purely material self to a more spiritual self. And this is in paper 1. In the inner experience of man, mind is joined to matter. Such material-linked minds cannot survive mortal death. And here is important. The technique of survival is embraced in those adjustments of the human will and those transformations in the mortal mind, whereby such a God consciousness intellect gradually becomes spirit-taught and eventually spirit-led. And this mechanic of changes in your mind, I did experience that. When I was young, I was quite materialistic. And being materialistic led me to make very bad decisions. And in my business, I just went bankrupt. And suddenly I realized I was not looking for the right values. And this is the mechanism of transformation in your mind that helps you to realize that the value you are looking are not the good one. And when you change this, when you take another point of view that gives you a complete different perspective, and this is this kind of channel of thinking that you built in your mind. So thank you for having pointed that out, because I believe it is very important in our way of thinking, of building those spiritual habits. Thank you, Geoff.
You're welcome. And there are very different functionalities of the maturing brain where we are, learning how to ride a bicycle and interact with others. It involves the myelin sheath on the axons of the nerves. This determines who you are, how you behave. When we get to the thought adjuster or thought controller phase, the mind mechanism or the brain mechanism, which is over-controlled by the mind, changes. The interaction, when you're a child, without the myelin sheath, there's very much more cross-pollination of thoughts. The thoughts are slower and they're much more cross-pollinized. When you get to knowing who you are as an adolescent, as a young adult, your thinking is very sure. You are absolutely sure. The older you get, the less sure you are, and the more your brain manages thoughts by this cross-pollination technique. But the difference is, in the early phases, it's biological. In the later phases, it's will control. You can control the cross-pollination of thoughts. And we talk about that mechanism. It involves those synaptic adhesin molecules. It involves the microtubules because they are actually the connection between the neurons in their neurotubule functions. So they are the cross-pollinators of our thoughts. So in the brain, the microtubules are doing this cross-communication mechanisms, and their patterns determine what kinds of thoughts get attention or get there first. If you think like Jesus, this kind of thinking precipitates the way you react to those thought patterns. The more you think like Jesus thinks, the more that becomes the religious habit. And it's a physiological mechanism. You just have to learn how that mechanism works. And by those repetitive decisions and sincerity processes, kind of artificially force it to happen until it becomes natural, until it becomes a habit. So yes, it's a learning technique. And once you sort of understand the physiology, then you realize that you're not, subject to predisposition. You can influence those incrementally over time. Thank you.
Yeah, this what the book told about spiritualization of the mind.
Exactly. Yes, which I think of as coherence. So when the material matter is receptive to spirit, you've changed the sort of base of your identity from the material, more chaotic, to the focused, creative, spirit-led thinking, that kind of thinking, the Jesus-like thinking. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Kurt, how you doing?
Very good. Geoff, I was fascinated by this, and as you were describing the physiology that can make us spiritually receptive, I got to thinking about the higher animals. Have you found anything in your research looking at how the brains of higher animals are functioned that would indicate the mechanisms that are really at work in adding that spiritual component, the consciousness of consciousness, the super consciousness, to the that makes us human?
Yes. And I think the answer is 300 milliseconds, maybe 500 milliseconds. But essentially, an animal has a sensory input and immediately reacts. There's no intervening sense of what do I do about that input. They see the garden hose and immediately think snake. We see the garden hose, think, oh, snake. No, it's just a garden hose. We have this override mechanism in the frontal cortex that says, don't worry, be happy. So yeah, that's what differentiates, I think, us from animals is that time. Where does that time happen? Well, it happens in the neurotubules. The longer your neurotubules are, the longer between sensory input and reaction to that input. What's happening in that time lag is that qubit interpretation of that sensory input. It's actually a quantum computer in each microtubule that's sending the information from cell to cell or from neuron to neuron. And as Georges said, that's our cross-pollination mechanism in the brain are these neurotubules. So it's that time differentiation and the interpretations that's going on in that time, I think, that differentiates us, which speaks to the spirit of truth influence. It speaks to the adjutant. The patterning gives us those 7 different levels of interpretation of sensory input, intuition, knowledge, counsel, those things. So each one of those is a pattern, a way we react to our sensory input.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting question. Yes. Tom.
How can we better our minds and our bodies? For example, and I know Mark is familiar with this. There is a surgeon that just published a book about all of the different additives in our food, 10,000 additives and dyes and so on that are approved here in this country, but are not approved in Europe. Even the foodstuffs and the eating too many carbs and that type of thing. How does that affect us and all the drugs that we take, a variety of different drugs? Should we be taking those drugs? how is it affecting the connection that we have with the thought adjuster? I know that Susan is really involved with doing yoga also. Is there some form of yoga that we can use or develop and practice ourselves as people in the movement to better ourselves, to have a better connection with our thought adjuster?
The processes are way too complex to overgeneralize. I think one thing we need to realize is that we have evolved out of the hunter-gatherer phase where our bodies are still thinking there's no such thing as too much sugar or too much carb density or too much caloric density. So our dopamine responses are still based on that food as the criteria in a food surplus environment. So we have to intellectually override those animal cravings that result in obesity. There are multiple things that relate to homeostasis, to the body of clean habits, but too complex to relate very much a personal, individual regimen for that ideal. I would question, is the goal longevity? Are you trying to live longer or live better? It says somewhere in the book, peace in this life, perfection in the next. So you're not going to have a perfect existence in this life. So at least be at peace with the process, or be at peace with where you are, calmly trusting that God's got the program and the Ancients of Days got the program, and the Most High's rule in the kingdoms of men.
You mentioned when Jesus left and the Spirit of Truth was dispersed around humanity and uplifted everybody. Do you expect, maybe because of how we've advanced the last 2,000 years, another step up somehow, like another gift of the Spirit of the Truth?
I think the Prince's gift to humanity was organizational mentality, sort of a community, learn how to do this in schooling. The Adamic uplift was biological. I think the Jesus uplift was our microtubules or other spiritual resonant coherence mechanisms with the anatomy that we have. So, given our ratio of Adamic input, will there be another one? I think we are unique in our need. And if there's going to be another one, it likely will be. I don't think it'll be intervention. I don't think it'll be an artificial. I personally see artificial intelligence as more artificial regurgitation of current intelligence, and very dependent on the database you're searching. But it's not creative. It's not new. It's not spiritual. It is just some mechanical rearrangement of what we currently know. If that triggers some creative input from you, so much the better.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good. Susan, you have some thoughts?
I'd like to speak to something that Mark and George and perhaps others, but specifically they spoke to. We're told that a lot of this interaction with spirit is unconscious. And I think most of us believe that. But Geoff, he won't just stop at that point. He goes, yes, it's unconscious, but I need to know how it happens. And so that's what all this is about. But when Mark spoke to his profound experience that he had on his grandmother's lap, and George to those, you call them those aha moments, but don't you realize it's in the looking back at that. At the time it's happening to you, you wouldn't see it or recognize, but it's in the looking back. And when we've been so blessed to have a number of those experiences in our lifetimes, you kind of know like one's coming, or I'm sort of in that same sense of what it's like when I do feel receptive to spirit. It becomes a more and more familiar type of being and way of life.
And then just briefly on what Thomas brought up, Sherry's a yogi. There's Bernie. There's a lot of practicing yogis and yoginis in the room. And there's a cute little T-shirt that says, "I do it for the Shavasana." And those of you who are familiar with yoga know that Shavasana is at the end when you're laying there like this. And so that be still and know that I am God. And you heard Geoff say over and over again to as many places in our busy, busy, busy lives that we can create those pauses, worship snacks, maybe you would call them, you know, just as you have a little snack of food, take a worship snack as often as you can and create those spaces of calm integrated into our lives so that more and more of this can happen. And we talk about, Geoff and I talk about that the master must have been like dual tracking all the time. Who was more active and who was more in tumult in his life than our master Jesus. And yet he must have been double tracking and carrying this deep, deep sense of his spiritual connection with God, this inner calm, that citadel of the spirit. So thank you for allowing me to make those comments.
Yeah, no, thank you, Susan, for chiming in. Mark, I'm going to hopefully come back to you, but I want to make sure to let people speak who haven't spoken yet. So Teresa?
I just want to refer to Geoff's mention of the electromagnetic field that our bodies possess. There's an American doctor who's done a lot of research, and what she recommends is that people walk barefoot on the earth because of the electromagnetic fields that the earth generates, and that actually improves our health. So all I wanted to say.
Yeah, you hear a lot about that now, the grounding blankets and all this sort of stuff. What's your take on that?
I don't know if any of you have been in a cold climate. You go shuffle across the floor on the rug and go to touch the doorknob. There's an immediate spark, bang. That's how long it takes to discharge. So if you're talking about the static energy buildup in the body, it's not actually necessary to go barefoot on wet grass. You can actually put conductive tape on the insole of your shoe. That does the same thing, keeps you grounded, keeps your electrical potential grounded. If you think of us as an electrochemical being, all of the functions in our body go on in the 70 millivolt range. All those bumps you see in an electroencephalogram, that's 70 millivolts maximum. So we are talking about very small voltages, and certainly grounding it has some benefit. I suspect it's a fairly small benefit, but we need all the help we can get. I do put conductive tape in my shoe for what it's worth. I don't know if it does anything, but it works.
Right. Okay, thanks. Sandra.
My question, Geoff, relates to the brain-gut relationship and people who have modified brains or bodies due to surgeries, illnesses, whatever. And if any of that kind of stuff will be covered in this course.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain gut is the vagus nerve, the intercellular communication that those microtubules do in the body and the neurotubules do in the brain. They're all related. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. It's the one that has the most connection influence between the two. You know, when you get excited, your stomach churns. The reaction to too much food, to fear results in sweaty palms and the hair standing up on the back of your neck. Those are all mind-body reactions. So yes, very much we do spend some time on that heart, brain. There's like I mentioned, serotonin, which is a very much gut-developed neurotransmitter, which involves many of those reactions. If you think of drugs like ecstasy, they're serotonin lookalikes. And the ayahuasca, DMT. A lot of them are neurotransmitter type drugs. So they're trying to fool the brain into those reactions. And we can do that mechanically. We can do that intellectually as well. So we don't need drugs to do it.
Thanks. Susan?
I've heard a lot and read some about the heart-mind connection, and the heart having its own mind. Does this play? Have you done any research, or what are your thoughts on that?
The heart-mind connection is, where do you begin or end? You're a connected being. Every cell of your body has these microtubules, has a communication to every other cell via these microtubules. So when you think mind, it's not brain. It is involving all of your cells, and they are all communicating simultaneously. Some time delay between gut to brain, from midbrain or brainstem to midbrain to frontal cortex. Those time delays are what allows you to process or to influence or override those animalistic emotional reactions. But we do act as an entity, and I like to think of mind as the sort of over controller of the patterns of all of this energy, this electromagnetic energy that's flowing through the brain and the other cells that have our DNA in our body, especially when they're duplicating. So, yes, we are a total package.
Thanks. Good point. Okay, Mark.
And have you ever studied some of these practices of ice immersion practices and how they affect the nervous system, and benefits maybe of something, those kind of things?
Yeah, there's a lot of different techniques. Cold shower, Dr. Popsicle, the ice immersions. There are vibrational ways to distract. Quite often what they do is to focus you. When we have the ability to process multiple thoughts, in various areas, and I think any of those tend to focus you. Hypnosis, for example, is a focus. The pranayama exercises in yoga are a focus. So really what we're trying to do is to channel the energy, and where your energy goes, where your thoughts go, your energy flows. So if you can channel that energy, it's an amazingly powerful tool. I did an experiment as a teenager where I was hypnotizing 3 or 4 of my friends, and we did a squeeze bulb test for strength. Under hypnosis, they could go very much higher than they could do even with raucous encouragement. Not in hypnosis. What's the difference? It's focus. So anything that provides you that singularity of mind, that focus, where does that happen? In worship. You've got that focused attention on God or on Jesus or on angelic intervention. What does it happen? It happens in prayer. Those are focusing mechanisms. If you need ice bath to do that focus, well, that's a little bit more dramatic, but if it works for you, go for it. But I think it all comes down to elimination of distractions. We are a very distracted society. We've got sports, we've got news, we've got elections, we've got neighbors, we got fences, we got lawns, we got all kinds of distractions. If we can focus that attention on the things that are meaningful, on the spiritual, the Urantia book says we spend much of our time on trivialities. If we can focus on things spiritual, we'll make some progress. So, my opinion.
Diane.
Yes, I'm very interested in the effects that parenting can have on children in directing their attention and introducing concepts that they may not otherwise discover till way in adulthood, begin their feet on a path. And so I'd love any kind of input that would help constitute a course in parenting in spiritual matters.
From my perspective, the thing that differentiates the sort of adult mind from the child mind is that level of trust. You have a parental trust. You know that the parents have your back. So anything you can do to reinforce that level of absolute trust, not absolute from a Urantia book sense, but trust in the parent. They know that no matter what they do, you've got them covered. So they can experiment. They can press the envelope. They can reach out and discover. They can learn what they're curious about, knowing that you've got their back. So,
thanks.
Thank you.
We sort of know, as you've said, meditation, yoga, these things that are fostering, and we can look at studies and see their effects physically. Are there any, or maybe they're up and coming, actual biofeedback mechanisms where you can sort of measure that this is working? I mean, obviously you have your ultimate, fruits of the spirit and whatnot, but you don't really know. We're sort of trying things like ice baths and, meditation, and we can look at our respiration and, heart rate and things like that. But are there on the horizon sort of more sophisticated feedback mechanisms where we could see some of these things in action?
Yes, the one I have that I enjoy most is the Muse. It's a headband you wear with electrical contacts, and it reads your brain waves and separates them into 4 or 5 categories. And when you calm the mind, you can see those levels drop. You can see some of them stay up and some of them go down. When you go into a worshipful state, you can see, what happens. And really what you're trying to do is to clear the chatter and get them to be nice and calm and flowy. And that gives you visibility of that. They have different techniques. When you get down to a certain stage, birds chirp, that say, yes, you're at a nice, relaxed state. So it's a kind of a feedback mechanism. That works for me.
Just MUSE, that's the product? Or that's
MUSE, correct.
Okay.
Put it on your Christmas list, Tim.
Right. Another thing I have to charge, probably. That's an element. Really, really an interesting area, and a very both aspirational and upward looking, but yet very practical, right? That we can start to think about these things and give some turn some of that material attention to the higher thoughts, distract our materialism with a material connection to the spiritual way, right? But really helpful, really great. And thank you so much for sharing with us.